Why is a constitution considered a higher law? What are the major characteristics of a higher law? How did the founders believe legitimate government was established? And how could higher law be used as a justification for revolution?
Quoting Proverbs 25:11, Abraham Lincoln described the ideas within the Declaration of Independence as the apple of gold within the Constitution's frame of silver. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it, he wrote. America's Constitution is its higher law because it remains flexible to safeguard its apple of gold by embodying natural law, channeling the people's moral law, and maintaining supremacy over statutes.
In section 217 of the Second Treatise, Locke defines natural law as the principle that universally governs mankind. Under this law, men are inherently rational and equal, and have fundamental rights to life, liberty, and property. The founders incorporated this natural law into the Constitution by giving the government a focus on protecting those three fundamental rights.
In contrast to the inherent subconscious nature of natural law, moral law is derived and conscious. Moral law differs among societies depending on their distinct cultural values, often manifesting itself through religion. Moral law is also reflected in constitutions, helping to make them higher law. For example, Puritan religious tenets were heavily reflected in the Charter of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, just as the principles of Islam are found in Iran's contemporary constitution. In both cases, higher laws borrow heavily from the moral law that prevails in their given societies.
Thus, a key characteristic of a higher law is its reflection of the cultural and religious values of the society it governs. Accordingly, U.S. higher law, the Constitution, is a combination of both natural law and the moral law of American society, enshrining the inherent rights of individuals and affirming American social values through the Bill of Rights. For instance, the Constitution, influenced by documents like the Virginia Declaration of Rights, advocates religious tolerance by preventing the establishment of a state religion in the First Amendment.
The final characteristic of higher law is its function in establishing the fundamental structures, powers, and scope of the government itself. In America, the Constitution is used as a broad and flexible basis to evaluate the validity of all other laws through the process of judicial review. Explicit constitutional supremacy is essential for this function of higher law and is established in Article 6, Clause 2.
The supremacy of higher law means nothing without the consent of the people. Because governments receive their mandate to rule from the people they govern, supremacy and legitimacy depend on popular sovereignty. However, higher law may not always remain legitimate. When laws fail to protect the natural rights of constituents or reflect changes in their moral principles, the people have the right to erect a government under a higher law they consent to instead.
For example, in 1775, to end the abridgment of their natural rights by an oppressive government, the founders established a new higher law through a revolution that was based on their popular sovereignty and invoked their consent to legitimately govern.
When a constitution is rendered illegitimate by failing to embody popular sovereignty, the moral values of its people, or the structure of government, revolutions become legitimate. The right to revolution has been exercised multiple times throughout history. In the modern era, the misalignment of women's rights with the higher law of fundamentalist Islamic theocracy in Iran, exacerbated by the killing of Mahsa Amini, exemplifies a justified indication of the right to revolution. Revolution, however, encompasses not only the replacement of government, but also the use of established legal processes to alter it.
Article 5 of the Constitution gives Americans a means to amend the higher law without overthrowing it. The 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to just 2 four-year terms of service, alters the Constitution to incorporate the essential American precept of a limited executive, for example.
While the founders' primary grievances were based on their lack of representation in Parliament, despite being subject to its regulations, the U.S. does the same thing to its 5 principal territories in the modern era under the guise of Article 4, Section 3 of the Constitution.
By abridging the citizenship rights of American Samoans and Puerto Ricans, the U.S. provides a justification for revolution to a group of people who are not given a voice in government. The Constitution must be amended to give access to both voting rights and federal benefits like Social Security and Medicare to all Americans, enhancing the legitimacy of America's higher law.
How about death of a constitution? We talked about the right to erect and an illegitimate government revolution. Should a constitution have a provision? Should just say right in there about how it should end and why?
Well, I don't think constitutions should include a provision for allowing a revolution to happen because I believe governments in power are inherently opposed to revolution happening. A good example would be Iran. Iran's current constitution actually includes a provision allowing for revolution. Article 2, Section 5 makes sure the government will fulfill its function of continually running, but also ensuring the uninterrupted process of revolution. Despite this, Iran has very visibly cracked down on people attempting to replace the Islamic theocracy that is currently in power.
Dr. Brewer?
Thank you. How are delegated powers related to the higher law?
So the reserved powers to the states in Amendment 10 of the Constitution are related to higher law insofar as they establish state constitutions as an arbiter of higher law in the cases of the reserved powers, namely education and the structure of state elections, for example. However, state governments are not higher law in all cases. The Constitution is still the highest law. For example, in Section 15A of the Virginia State Constitution's Bill of Rights, same-sex marriages are not recognized as legitimate under the Virginia Commonwealth. But this provision in the state constitution is obviously trumped by Obergefell v. Hodges, the Supreme Court case. So in certain cases that are not related to the delegated powers, the state constitutions lack supremacy that the Constitution holds uniformly.
We can also look to the Virginia Constitution, specifically in Article 11, Section 4, which gives Virginia citizens the right to hunt game and fish. And this seems like a very specific and almost arbitrary inclusion in the Virginia State Constitution, but actually it reflects a very important principle in that state constitutions give very regional and specific rights to their citizens that are specific to that state and are sometimes not included in other state constitutions or the federal constitution.
Thank you.
Let me push a bit on this idea of change. So you seem to suggest, like we've been talking about revolution, and that it almost like it includes amendment and judicial review. But these are there's something about a rejection of the existing structure that's necessary for a revolution, right? You're throwing out everything. So what kinds of abuses would we need to see in order to justify a full revolution, a scrapping of the Constitution as opposed to just amending or judicial review?
Well, I believe the scrapping of the Constitution would have to come from a place of the government taking over the role of abridging people's natural rights. It's no longer just certain things that need to be amended to respect people's moral laws, but it is a fundamental disagreement with what the people believe in. In section 221 of John Locke's treatise, he specifies that the government should be rightfully dissolved when it makes itself an arbitrary disposer of the people's health, life, liberty, or their fortunes. Other examples when a government falls apart is in 219 of the second treatise, when there's no longer the administration of justice to protect the natural rights of man, or when there is no force to meet the necessities of the people. There's no government at all.
We also hold that the amendment process, as you mentioned in your question, is included in this right to revolution, that revolution is any form of an alteration of government itself. While the amendment process established in Article 5 is a good procedural way to do this in a peaceful manner, we do recognize, just as Locke does in his second treatise, that if there is a misalignment between the people's natural or moral laws within the higher law of the Constitution, that does give the people as a majority, that misalignment also would have to affect a wide cross-section of the population, not just a small subset of people. That would be a legitimate reason to revolt.
Does a country need a constitution? I'm hearing a lot of talk about revolution. That sounds messy, destructive, terrible. And we've got examples of unwritten constitutions. Do we really need one?
I would argue that a country does not explicitly need a written constitution. We can look to countries such as England and Israel who have unwritten constitutions. Specifically in England, their higher law is composed of judicial decisions, acts of parliaments, and other things that compose higher law. So in the case of England, they do not have a specific written constitution as the United States does, but that doesn't mean their higher law doesn't exist. Their higher law instead values what John Locke described as the essence and union of society and enumerating the values and morals of the country.
I disagree with my unit mate. I think that an established constitution and a written constitution is fundamental to a successful nation that invokes the popular sovereignty of its people. One of the chief concerns of anti-federalists, the Constitutional Convention, was that if the Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights, that the government would overstep its bounds and would fundamentally abridge the rights of the people. And I think that is an important aspect of constitutions that must be included in statutorily, not just through like court precedent or judicial decisions. Because when these rights are enshrined and fundamental and higher than the government itself, that means that the right to revolution need not be exercised if the government is protecting these natural and fundamental rights.
A quick question. Yesterday, I believe it was, President Biden signed a congressional bill speaking to the rights of people to marry. Why was that necessary? Oh. Saved by the bell.
Cliffhanger. Leave it alone. Great job, guys.
Incredibly strong. I'm gonna critique you. It's hard to do. It's gonna be really nitpicky stuff, but overall, wow. The reasoning, a lot of groups are able to give specifics. It's very hard to tie the reasoning, and you could always reason with your specifics. I would say United Kingdom versus England. England's a nation within the country of the United Kingdom. England doesn't have a constitution. I told you I'm going to be nitpicky. Okay, so I'm a Christian, so I'm loving you're starting off with Proverbs. But I'm a Christian. And you talked about country values very well. I think I would tie in some language as to why you did Proverbs. Because you were doing cultural values reflected in the Constitution, just as you cited it, within the same sentence. I think I'd tie into something why you use that. Speaking poise and speed, I have nothing to, I can't help you at all. The poise, the speed, I loved it.
Agreed. I'm going to disagree with the quote from Proverbs because I wrote it down because I perked up. I thought that was a bit of an odd way to start too, but it was Lincoln's quoting Lincoln's quote from Proverbs. Jack, was it you? So I don't have an issue. Although I think that's to be thought through, you know, for your next, if you prepare again. I heard a phrase called evaluate validity. I like that phrase. I think we don't do enough of that, and you pointed that out a couple times. Gosh, I wish I could read all what I wrote down. I thought it was interesting that you cited Iran several times. I mean, that I've got to think that one over. I mean, not bad, good, or otherwise. I think that was a really kind of thoughtful and unexpected way to approach some of this, I guess. And John Locke, of course, yada yada. Okay, thank you. I think you did a great job.
Yeah, I just, stellar reasoning here. I would talk about strategy with you folks, because you're like, at the level where we think about this, like, I really appreciate bold arguments. And so I actually disagree. I don't think revolution includes amendment and judicial review, but I really like that you're like, no, this is our stand. And I always appreciate that when students take strong stands. Calling for revolution in Puerto Rico and Samoa, yes, it warms my heart. Let's do it. Let's set fire to everything. The one thing I would suggest you think about, and I don't know if you should think about doing differently, is that we've seen some teams today that had a lot, I think, more sort of volume of examples to pull out in their arsenal. I feel like every time you pulled out an example, it's like a home run, like that Virginia Constitution example, the referencing Iran, fantastic examples that really just incredibly used. But I just felt like maybe even in the original narrative, a few more examples sprinkled, like specifics, might really help sell it. It's like the one thing that I think might be lacking here, because otherwise it was just fantastic work, really great work, guys.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, we're fist bumping like air